Hello again. In this lecture, I want to talk about Albert Camus, the 20th century French writer and thinker. After Freud, and after the era that Freud's death marks the end of, starting in September 1939, things in the world went from bad to worse. If people had thought that World War I was a terrible event for humanity, World War II was positively apocalyptic. World War II saw the first bombings of cities where rivers in the cities boiled from the heat of the fires, boiling alive people who had jumped in the rivers. World War II saw the worldwide extermination of peoples through the use of death camps, in China of gases, and then of course ultimately the war climaxes with suicide bombs of the kamikazes and then the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Two cities left explicitly untouched by the American Allied Air Forces so that they could be used as demonstrations of what these new weapons could do. World War II left an enormous open space in the minds of many intellectuals. They thought that after the war, things would have to be different, things would have to change dramatically, lest humanity end up destroying itself. But almost as soon as the war ended, people began again to revert to their old ways of thinking. Among the intellectuals who dealt with the war and who worried about this, responses to the fact of this evil and then the astonishing recovery of normalcy after the war were manifold. Some people tried to reaffirm old models of thinking. Some explored wholly new ones. Albert Camus really falls more in the latter category, though he has a deep attachment to traditional ways of thinking, religious and philosophical, about evil. Now, Camus lived from 1913 to 1960, when he died tragically, actually, in an auto accident. And he was a brilliant writer and thinker, deeply politically engaged, but always more free-thinking than his more doctrinaire compatriots, such as Jean-Paul Sartre. Probably, in my estimation, which is a relatively biased estimation, but probably Camus' work will have a longer-lasting impact and a more profound impact on the way people think about how to inhabit our world than Sartre's did. Now, his work is well known and often described as a kind of existentialism, and indeed Camus sometimes called it absurdism. But in fact, it's probably more profoundly useful to call it an atheistic humanism with a deep appreciation both for the spiritual impulse in humanity and for the way that that impulse can be organized and sometimes, not infrequently, manipulated by official religions. Camus was from North Africa. He was from French colonial stock in North Africa and was raised and educated there. His father had died before he was born, actually. His father died in the First World War. And so he was brought up with his mother as a ward of the state, a hero's son. He wrote his master's thesis, his final academic work, on St. Augustine, actually, whose own thinking on good and evil influenced him in surprising ways, in ways that I don't think people have really fully appreciated yet. Before the war, he was a well-known writer already, having written a book which was devastating in its power, called L'étranger, or The Stranger, the foreigner, the strange one, about a man whose experience of the world is so distant, so buffered from emotional reality, that he seems an actual kind of threat to everyone around him. Now, during World War II, Camus was in Paris, and he joined the resistance and edited the resistance paper, Combat. After the liberation, in August of '44, he was one of the very few publicly, at the end of the war, to condemn the Allies' use, the American use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In other words, he was already a friendly critic of those people on his own side when he thought that they were doing horrible, evil things. In the years after the war, he and Sartre grew apart until a profound split happened in the wake of the publication of his novel, Camus' novel, The Plague, in 1948. And we'll talk about that later in this lecture. In 1957, he won the Nobel Prize for his overall work, the year after the other novel we'll talk about, The Fall, La Chute, was published. But he died tragically. One almost successfully resists saying absurdly, in a car accident in 1960. He was just 47. He wrote a number of very influential books, but two books in particular have had enormous impact on thinking about evil in the post-World War II era. Well, that's not exactly true. One of them has had an enormous and well-recognized impact, and the other deserves to have that impact. Those two books are his two novels, The Plague and The Fall. Let me talk a bit about The Plague here. Now, in The Plague, Camus allegorizes the corruption of a society by evil through the metaphor of a plague infesting a city. The novel chronicles the appearance, the emergence, the rise, the climax, and the defeat of the plague. It tracks the ways that a series of characters, most famously the central narrator of the novel itself, and then also one of the main figures in it, is a man named Dr. Rieu, a doctor. But there are others as well. Importantly for our purposes, one of them is Father Peneleu. And the novel basically tracks the way that humans inside the city of Oran, in Algiers, actually try to confront and handle the various problems brought on by the plague. Now, of course, the plague here is not just a biological pestilence. In a way, the plague, the pestilence itself, is an allegory for Nazi evil, for an evil that possesses a society. And the story is really about how humans resist that evil, but it's carried out very rigorously through the image, the allegory of the plague itself. And Camus uses various characters in the novel as devices to explore how certain approaches to the world, certain sets of beliefs, will actually work themselves out in confrontation to absolute evil of this sort. Dr. Rieu is rigorously empirical, but he's not a narrow believer in science alone. Though he does, in fact, have a broad humanistic education, he still resists any kind of false consolation of the sort he thinks religion would offer. Father Peneleu, who initially offers a kind of relatively moralistic vision of the plague, delivering a sermon, interpreting the plague as a sign of God's wrath at and displeasure with humanity. But as he lives more into the suffering of his own people, and he fights the plague, he then delivers a second sermon where he preaches a response of absolute moral and spiritual commitment as the only remedy to the plague. Right? Much like many Catholic priests that Camus knew in the resistance, he was clearly motivated by his religion, by his spiritual faith. It was not a faith that Camus shared, but it was one that he respected enough to see that it could actually motivate powerful moral resistance to evil. Father Peneleu dies near the end of the book when he's infected. Now, one of the most interesting and thought-provoking themes in the book is the extreme resistance of humanity to coming to terms with and bringing into focus the plague, the problem of evil itself. Initially, in the book, many are reluctant to recognize the plague for what it is. The city authorities don't want to admit it. Other doctors don't want to say what it is. Even the people who are suffering from it don't want to think it is what they come to realize it really is. They prefer instead to imagine that what they're dealing with here is a pretty ordinary illness. Then, as this goes on, they seek some sort of larger cosmic explanation for the plague. So Father Peneleu's first sermon is a good example of this. Somehow, there's something we did, there's some explanation for this evil that we must kind of figure out so that we can unlock the puzzle and come to deal with this evil by addressing its kind of root conditions, right? There must be something we can do to fix this. Think about this as echoing the Epic of Gilgamesh in some ways, because it kind of does. And the final step for Camus, and again, this is also very Gilgameshy, if we want to use that word. Finally, the most acute and the wisest of them, come to see that those ultimate cosmic questions are unanswerable. The answers we offer to the cosmos, the explanations we provide that might be useful for illuminating the problem of evil in this way, are returned unopened to the sender, in a way. And our puzzles with these metaphysical questions, these cosmic questions, are often, Camus suggests, used as ways to distract us from the real facts of the case, from the reality before our faces, and that the best course of action, those who can truly see realize, the wise recognize. The best course of action is to not worry about those questions, but instead to face the plague for what it was, to meet it where it was, and fight it as best they could. But then, as the plague finally ebbs away and is ultimately defeated for Camus, and all returns again to normal, at the end of the novel, Dr. Rieu points out it's astonishing how quickly the plague and its terrors are forgotten, how quickly people return to a state of normality, where these kinds of realities are, in astonishing ways, kind of forgotten, unwritten into our history. There's a story of the plague, but the real story of the plague, the real story of what happened in those events, Dr. Rieu writes, Camus suggests about the resistance and about evil, the evil of the Nazi regime. The real story, in some sense, never gets told because people can't process it into their ordinary experience of life. So all of the people of Oran, the city where this happens, deny the reality, ultimately, of what happened. They say, oh, it was a bad time, but things are much better now. Let's eat, drink, and be merry. Let's not continue to brood on the plague. In a way, this is a kind of cruel representation of the city and of ordinary people for Camus. He really does think that most people simply don't bother to worry about these things. Before the plague happens, there's a kind of staticness to Iran. Not much happens there. When it hits, it stops business entirely, the ordinary life of the people of Iran, the way that they use their business life to distract themselves from the emptiness of their own world. Right? This is Camus is a descendant of Pascal here, and Pascal's notion of divertissement. And so in the plague, it's not just that the plague is an experience of terror. It's also that in that plague, they're thrown back on themselves in a way they find deeply discomforting. Now, the lesson of this novel is straightforward. Evil is real. It will confront us. And all we can do is decide how we will respond to it. In the words of a famous Camus essay written around this time, we must decide to be neither victims nor executioners, right? We must decide to be neither those who will stand and just be shot down, nor those who will do the shooting. This is especially important for Camus because evil is not going away. It will remain a perennial problem for human beings. There is no this worldly, apocalyptic solution to evil. There's no fix to it. We're going to face these problems again and again. And as the final prophetic paragraphs of the plague, La Peste, put it, I'm going to read you this. Nonetheless, he, Dr. Rieu, he knew that the tale he had to tell could not be one of a final victory. It could be only the record of what had to be done and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts. Despite their personal afflictions, by all who, while unable to be saints, but refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers. It's just, thinking about that, it strikes me as so prophetic, even of our own time. To those who know they have to deal with terror and fear and wrath. And then he goes on, and this is truly one of the most prophetic texts of the 20th century. And indeed, as he listened to the cries of joy rising from the town as the festival at the end of the book, at the end of the plague. There's a festival in the town, and there are fireworks going off, and people are very, very happy about the end of the plague, of course. As he listened to the cries of joy rising from the town, Ryu remembered that such joy is always impermanent. He knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books. That the plague bacillus never dies or disappears for good. That it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chests. That it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves. And that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and the enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. The days after September 11th, actually, when in my world a lot of people were circulating a poem by W.H. Auden, a wonderful poem called September 1st, 1939, a poem he wrote about the beginning of the Second World War. I kept thinking about this passage in Camus' Plague. It was a lesson that we were going to have to learn again about evil and the various ways people try to resist it in all their best intention. Some of them wise, some of them not wise, some of them successful, some of them not successful. Not always the wise ways being the successful ways. In all these ways, Camus strikes me as still someone of tremendous import for our world. Interestingly, though, Camus, especially in The Plague, was criticized by his contemporaries, particularly on the communist left in France, thinkers such as Sartre, for offering an essentially quietistic approach to evil. He depicted, they said, in The Plague, evil as a depoliticized, dehistoricized, natural force, right? A plague, a bacilli, not at all the doing of actual human beings for real political motives. And this is strange, they said, because Camus himself was so deeply politically engaged, and also because the world that they saw presented no such unhuman natural force of evil. They weren't interested in the natural evils of earthquakes or things like that. That's a problem that in some ways we have to deal with, but that's not the real problem, they said. World War II was not a natural evil. The malice that we see around us, Albert, they were saying to Camus, the malice we experience, that you fought, that was clearly human. But you know, Camus has a response. And if you understand his point, the issue is there may be human malice, but it's not contingent in the sense that it will ever go away. The problem is that we have to learn how to address and confront evil. Yes, its configurations in the human world will differ from historical moment to historical moment, but evil itself will never go away, he thought. That's a very Augustinian point, and it's precisely because it is Augustinian in that way, on the intractability of human evil, that so many of the communists in his world who really were working out of a Marxist view, right, where evil is fundamentally, essentially contingent, they couldn't stand that. Ironically, the debate between Camus and Sartre was really a debate between Augustine and Marx, but they didn't really realize it at the time. Maybe Camus did a little bit. So that's one novel of Camus. But then 8 years later, he writes another, and equally interesting, in some ways far more troubling, far more ambiguous novel. One in which the human situation is more ambivalent, where, in fact, there may not just be no saints, but in some ways, everyone might be a sinner. Now, the fall, la chute in French, has the connotations of religious fall, as well as the fall off of something, in this case, a fall off of a bridge, and also the connotations of a moral collapse. So it's more like the collapse almost in English, but it would have to include some sort of connotation of the fall. The narrator of the novel, Jean-Baptiste Clémence, is a human caught in the self-awareness of his own and his world's sin in a way that he recognizes, but he cannot quite name, nor can he escape. His name itself is really interesting. Jean-Baptiste Clémence. His name is John the Baptist. Clémence, crying. In Latin, the phrase is vox clamans in deserta, a voice crying in the desert, a voice crying in the wilderness. John the Baptist, the prophet. So on one level, he's a prophet, foretelling a coming of a new order. But in another way, he presents himself, interestingly, as at the center of the web. He lives in the innermost ring of the Ring of Canals in Amsterdam, where he sits in a bar called the Mexico City. The innermost ring of a series of concentric canals. What does that make you think of? Satan in Dante's Inferno, another illusion that Jean-Baptiste Clément himself understands and appreciates. In the novel, he tells the story of his own collapse, but he does that in order to convince the person he's talking to. It's a monologue, so he's trying to talk to the author, the reader, convince the person he's talking to that they are also unworthy. And by convincing them that they are unworthy, he will feel supreme above them. So his strategy is seduction by narcissism. And yet, the seduction he employs is an incredibly self-conscious one, for he realizes that the narcissism that he deploys to seduce people actually governs his own life, even to the degree that his own confession of his sins is an attempt to make his audience admire him and respect him. This picture has never been equaled. The story Clément tells of his own initial career as a great defense lawyer in Paris, particularly of widows and orphans, is a really interesting one. Initially, he thought he was a really noble person, but after a while, he came to see that life as tremendously egotistical, all about promoting himself. And he came to see that life that way because of a series of events that happened. One night, walking across a bridge in Paris, after a successful, not just court date, but then assignation with a woman, he passes by a young woman leaning over the side of the bridge. Once he's passed, he hears a body plunge in the river and a series of cries as the person is carried downstream. He freezes. He could have run back, jumped in and saved her, but he doesn't. He later calls this event his baptism, and he makes it the focal point of a reconsideration of the whole shape of his life, discovering in it a history of selfishness and narcissism that he had kept from his own self-awareness. It is then an event that, once it hits him in its reality, is not just his baptism, but also his fall. And it serves as a crucial moment in his moral collapse, and as well in the story he tells to try to shore up his ruins, facing the recognition of that moral collapse. Now he lives in Amsterdam, and he defends criminals, and he hides in his apartment a panel of a stolen painting, The Just Judges. It's an interesting one to hide. He cannot stand to have just judges out there in public. He hides it in a closet in his room. Now he has a powerful aversion to thinking directly about justice and innocence because he believes that everyone is guilty. The task for humanity, he believes, has now become how to live with our guilt. For there is no way to escape it. As he says near the end of the novel, and really in reference to himself, this is in some ways, the most sincere moment in the novel, the one sincere moment in the novel. He says, but this is my life. This is who I am. I'm a wretched egotist who only feels good when I'm bringing other people down. But he says, but what can one do to become another? That simple question contains all the sincerity of a psychological anxiety that the rest of the prose of the novel refuses and obscures. Sin for Clément, sin for this John the Baptist, is real, but grace is not. The character feels trapped in the fall, hopeless, stuck at the end of in the bottom of hell, in the middle of the concentric rings, trapped there in his own despair. This novel as well ends with what actually has been, I think, an even more devastating peroration about what to think about life as a figure like Jean-Baptiste Clément, when he finally finds out who the other person is, the person he's been talking to, in some ways, the reader of the book. He says, you too were once a lawyer, I knew it all along, right? And then he says this to his interlocutor, Please tell me what happened to you one night on the quays of the Seine, and how you managed never to risk your life. You yourself utter the words that for years have never ceased echoing through my nights, and that I shall at last say through your mouth. Right? These are words that Clément has, he admits, wanted to say all the time since this night on the bridge, since his fall. This is what he's always wanted to say. O young woman, throw yourself into the water again, so that I may a second time have the chance of saving both of us. A second time, what a risky suggestion. Just suppose, dear sir, cher maître, that we should be taken literally. We'd have to go through with it. Brr, but the water is so cold. But let's not worry. It's too late now. It will always be too late. Fortunately. Just think about that end. That end kills me every time I read it. It's too late now. It will always be too late. Fortunately. There's a lot packed in there, right? First of all, the fundamental despair of Clément at the recognition that he has this incredible longing that he wants things to be otherwise. He doesn't want to be damned. He doesn't want to be a sinner. He doesn't want to be a moral failure. He doesn't want to be in love with himself in this way. He wants to risk his life for something greater than himself, for another person. He had the chance once, and it's never come again. It couldn't come again, because in this life you only get that one chance. There is no grace. There are no second chances. It's always too late. We're always already trapped in sin. And then the devastating last word, fortunately. Right? Of course, Camus is playing on the joke of the fortunate fall, the felix culpa here. In some fortunate way, we're lucky, Jean-Baptiste Clément says, that we cannot do anything here. But his notion of the felix culpa is both incredibly ironic and has at its heart a kind of utter despair of any hope. The reason this is fortunate is because we would just fail again. That's not the fortune of the traditional felix culpa. The reason the traditional felix culpa is fortunate is because our failure enables Christ to come and save people. Jean-Baptiste Clément, a voice crying in the wilderness, prophesies no Christ. He only prophesies our own fall. Here, unlike in the plague, recognition of evil seems to paralyze and corrupt, not to mobilize and purify. So are these two books' accounts of evil comparable? Compatible? Well, one thing they both have in common, and that they share with Conrad and Freud and distantly with someone like Nietzsche, can we take the moral phenomena that we capture in the term evil seriously enough? Does our moral self-understanding, the way we picture the world as a whole, the shape of our lives within it, really help us come to grips with the realities that we call evil? And this is one of Camus' most profound themes in all his writing. Is it possible, he worries, that there is something in human nature that makes it hard to take evil seriously enough? Of all the lessons that Camus has, giving us that question and keeping it alive in our minds is perhaps the one that I'm most grateful for. We live in a world, he says, that has a hard time seeing evil, recognizing it for what it is. We'd rather avoid seeing it in the world outside or in ourselves. We either make it into something that it's not, an ordinary natural illness, or maybe a vast metaphysical evil that is in some sense something we can never resist, when we actually ought to see it for what it actually is, which is a human corruption that perhaps, just perhaps, we may, with some good fortune, or possibly some grace, be able to confront and resist. It's a moral victory just to see clearly for Camus. It's also a moral victory to be able to communicate that vision to others. This is something he shares very deeply with Joseph Conrad. And once we have seen evil for what it is, we must confront it, he thinks, knowing that there are no guarantees, no promises of victory, nor any consolations of an ultimate theological victory if we lose in the here and the now. All we have is the knowledge that evil is evil, and that we should not be evil. And so we owe it to ourselves, if we are the kinds of beings we take ourselves to be, to fight it. Now, in our next lecture, I want to look at some religious thinkers, contemporaneous with Camus, who also responded to the various crises of the Second World War and tried very hard to take the evil that had reared its head in those events as seriously as it merited. So we'll do that next.